William James is significant for three fields of study, both the fields of psychology, philosophy and religion. And the very fact that he's significant for these three fields of study shows something important about interdisciplinary thinking at the end of the 19th century. He was transdisciplinary and, crucially, significant in the formation and the beginning of all of these three disciplines. William James was born in 1842 in New York City in the Astor House Hotel. This is significant for a number of reasons. 1842 was the year that Emerson delivered his famous lecture on the Transcendentalists, signifying a new philosophical moment in American history. And also, it was significant because Emerson was there at the birth, or just after the birth, of William James, visiting the father of William James, Henry James Sr. Emerson and Henry James Sr. had a strong friendship which emerged out of their theological and personal quests. But whereas the figure of Emerson succeeded in a career outside his Unitarian ministry as a public speaker, Henry James Sr. had struggled in all sorts of different ways to establish a clear profession. Significantly because he was a man of wealth and many means. He had inherited a tremendous wealth from his father William of Albany, who came from County Cavan in the north of Ireland and established a trading post in New York City sometime after 1789. In that time, he generated wealth through the trading post, but also significantly by buying land in Syracuse, which contained salt. And the importance of salt for trade across the Atlantic was very important and ultimately generated an extraordinary amount of personal wealth. From his context in Ireland and family back in also in Scotland, he brought with him, as well as this wealth, a strong Presbyterian context, and the family, the James family, were driven by a Calvinistic consciousness. Henry James Sr. inherited that Calvinistic zeal and indeed had hoped to go to theological college, but in conflict with his father eventually dropped out. And that conflict with the father is also significant because it relates to a trauma that Henry Sr. had when he was a child, around about 13, when he was playing a game of air balloons, which started a fire which he tried to put out. And in the attempt to stamp out this fire, he burnt his leg severely, and this required, over a number of years, 2 amputations, one below and one above the knee. Now, this combination of a trauma goes deep into the James family and will be significant, of course, for William James as well. But it's the combination of Calvinistic zeal, an internal guilt around these events, and a problematic relationship with the grandfather William of Albany that all lead into the very peculiar education that the James children would have. The James family, of course, is also well known, not just for William, the elder child, as being one of the founders of psychology and the founders of pragmatist philosophy in America, but also for the second child, Henry Jr., who obviously is the famous novelist. There were 2 other children whose significance is not so well known because they were caught up in the American Civil War and he went to fight in the war. Wilkinson and Robinson were 2 of the sons that went out to fight and never really recovered from their Civil War experience. And indeed, Garth Wilkinson, the 3rd child, was severely injured, and William James drew pictures of him on his return from this Civil War battle. There was a 5th child, Alice, the only girl, and she is very famous for her diaries, and struggling with bouts of illness and mental illness as well as physical illness throughout her life. But her diaries have become an important feminist tract for understanding the plight of women at this period of history. So we have here a very creative family of the Jameses, which capture both European and American intellectual history. And one of the other significant factors in the life of William James is that wealth not only enabled him to be born in a hotel as he was waiting for the family home to be ready just off Washington Square in the place which is now occupied by New York University, but it also meant that the James family had tremendous access to travel. And in many ways, the James family is a transatlantic family. And that transatlantic life, as the Henry Sr., the father, had very traumatized experiences, as I've indicated, and he often took the family off across to Europe whenever he faced a personal crisis. And this, in many ways, is important to recognize because it tells us something about the formation of William James, as well as the other Jameses. But what we learn from it is that William James is enculturated into European thinking as much as North American thinking. William James was taken by his father on many travels, as I've said, and this included education in Paris, in Switzerland and in Germany. And indeed, William James has access and worked with French and German texts throughout his writing. But one of the other key factors is that on one of those travels, Henry Sr. had a traumatic moment, 1844, what was later described as a vastation following the work of Emanuel Swedenborg. Many thinkers think that this Swedenborgian moment of Henry Sr. had a strong influence on William, though I personally think that this is overplayed, and I think that what's much more significant for the thinking of William James is his Calvinist background. And we see the elements of this strong Protestant thinking right through James's thought, as I will explain a bit later. So James, born into a rich transatlantic family, educated across Europe, able to work in a variety of different languages. But with this wealth and access, and privately educated by the father prized the first two sons, that's William and Henry, and believed that they could achieve many things as they did. But alongside that was a traumatic life, caught in the neurotic and difficult personality of the father. And this meant that despite their intellectual successes, there was also a lot of personal struggles. And William James, in his formation, faced a number of personal anxieties related to this context. The first struggle, again replicating his father's life, was a choice of career. Originally, William James had wanted to become an artist, and indeed had in the late 1850s gone off to train in artistic work, to the displeasure of a father who valued the sciences. But the William James who pursued art also fell in line to some extent with the father, and eventually went off in 1861 to the Lawrence Scientific School in Boston to train. He also trained a little later as in medicine. But these studies were disrupted because of a deeper personal search and problem, a real sense of suffering of life, the meaning of life, and led to bouts of time replicating his father's moving across from America to Europe by going off to study some of the physiologists in Germany and taking periods of time out, so that his formation was interrupted before establishing his career. Another early part of this is that James's development was caught inside the debates about Darwin, the origin of the species, and the central biological debates. And it's important to see that when James went off to the Royal Scientific School, he was studying anatomy and physiology, and that is the root of much of his thinking and remains the root of his thinking. And in 1865, in fact, went off to Brazil on exhibition to the Amazon under the direction of Louis Agassiz, who was somebody in the debate about evolution with Darwin. In fact, Darwin quotes some of the work of Agassiz in The Origin of Species. And James went off on this trip. It was quite a challenging trip. In fact, he caught a fever, a serious fever on that trip. But they were looking for species of fish across two different rivers to prove the theories of distinct species or to challenge the evolutionary thesis. Of course, James in time didn't follow Agassiz's work, but actually followed Darwin in his thinking, and we can see this biological Darwinianism framing some of James's early thinking. So, a traumatic formation, but eventually the two factors brought stability to James. They were getting a position to study physiology and to teach physiology and anatomy at Harvard, and of course marrying Alice Gibbons. These were stabilizing presences. He had earlier on experienced quite a bit of trauma, not unlike his father, his 1844 vastation. James has had an experience of a sense of complete and utter emptiness around 1870. And there were two things that brought James out of this desperation, a sense of void and an emptiness. And they were the philosophy of the 19th century neo-Kantian Charles Renouvier, who developed a philosophy related to experience, but also to a philosophy of relation, which deeply influenced James, and also the poetry of Wordsworth. Though we do have, strangely, an account of this devastating moment of William James is in the Varieties of Religious Experience itself, though it's actually set up in terms of a case from a French doctor. But we now know that this is actually William James's own account from his diary, where he had the feeling that he was like an image of an epileptic patient who was suffering in a hospital that this doctor had seen. This was actually James himself had seen, and sitting on a windowsill curled up like a Peruvian mummy, he says. And William James has this moment where he says, "That shape am I," and this was the moment of utter depression. Significantly, the one thing that kept James sane through that moment, which we learn in the Varieties of Religious Experience, was actually biblical text, the repeating of biblical texts, and the centrality of the Bible in James's background is important, as I've indicated. Both he has this Calvinistic context through the father's own theological work, and the father wrote many theological texts, were very unsuccessful theological texts about suffering and sin, related, as I've pointed out, to this trauma and the combination of dealing with that trauma and leaving theological college. So James had always had that atmosphere, a kind of unique, if you like, theological training through the father and with elements of Swedenborg. But from this, he managed to kind of build a sense of the importance of experience. The father's theology was actually built upon undermining the self in order that the glory of God could be fully redemptive. But James was able to kind of reposition that, to revalue human experience as part of an understanding of God's presence. And we see this in much of the kind of embodied theological work, which I will explain later on. Now, I think that with this sort of combination of both a scientific background, moving through with a theological edge, demonstrates something quite unique about the James family in holding together science and literature. And it's often said of William James that he wrote his psychology like a novelist, and it's often said of Henry James, the novelist, James Jr., that he wrote his novels like a psychologist. So you get this kind of mixture of both forms. And again, that would reflect how William James evolved in his thinking to kind of bridge both the biological and the philosophical. So through these various developments, the career at Harvard stabilized him, and he had three different sets of position. Through the 1872, he began in lecturing in anatomy. He then moved on to lecture in physiological psychology, 1876, and then in 1880 had the position of philosophy. And I think that what's significant about that is that